talk, so over to you.
Thank you. So good evening. It's great to see you all here tonight, and also a big welcome to our listeners in Aberdeen as well. So I'm going to tell you about Mary Rose, from Seabed to Showcase, the making of a British icon. It's a really unique story, and it's a really unique product as well. Mary Rose is the key ship of a key king, Henry VIII. She was dramatically sunk and dramatically rediscovered and raised from the bed of the Solent against all the odds. It's a story of drama, human endeavour against all the odds, innovation, and quite frankly, sheer bloody mindedness on the part of so many people who refuse to give up in the face of so many obstacles. And now she has been displayed in Portsmouth in a purpose-built museum, and that's in Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, which is only 90 minutes away from here by train from Waterloo, so don't think it's a barrier. We'd love to see plenty of you down there. So I'll take you through the story of Mary Rose. I'll explain the story of her raising from the seabed and her installation into museum. And importantly, I'll show you how science has underpinned the whole story throughout the decades. But as the intro just told you, I am no scientist. So I will talk about science, but if you ask me difficult questions, I'm going to struggle. I will do my best. But I'm very much picking the brains of my scientists at Mary Rose with this presentation, so bear with me. So, Henry VIII. How many of us see him like this? We all have this view of Henry VIII as this enormously obese man throwing chicken bones across the banquet, eating too much, going through 6 wives. That's always the image that we have. When Henry came to the throne, he was only 17. He was seen as the ultimate Renaissance prince. Everybody in Europe looked up to him. He was enormously desirable. Many women wanted to marry him, which becomes a bit more understandable when you see this sort of picture versus the fat Henry ones that you're so familiar with. He unexpectedly became heir to the English throne after the death of his brother Arthur in 1502. And as part of his training, which his father Henry VII did with him, he took him down to Portsmouth to actually see some ships being built. And Henry VII was the one who first established dry docks down at Portsmouth. And he got the ship bug from that visit. And that's why he was so interested in ships going forward. So when he came to the throne, he was full of testosterone. He was 17. He styled himself King of England and France. And he was quite serious about that. He very much saw himself following in the footsteps of Henry V and taking over huge tracts of French territory. So that was his key aim when he came to the throne. He wanted to declare war on France. His council, being a lot older and wiser, were quite clear on how much that would cost and how much it would take out of England, and decided to dissuade him by offering him the opportunity to build some new ships. So he commissioned Mary Rose and her sister ship, Peter Pomegranate, and that was his sop to not declaring war on the French at the time. So he styled his navy, his army by sea. He only had 8 ships when he took on the throne of England. By the end of his reign, he had 58, and he truly was the start of the Royal Navy. In terms of Mary Rose's name, there are various theories about it, but I think the most credible ones are that Mary came from the Virgin Mary. They were incredibly pious at the time. And Rose came from the Tudor Rose, which, as many of you will know, it was the union of the Yorkist and Lancaster roses when Henry VII married Elizabeth of York. And that was really, I always describe the Tudor Rose as early branding, because the Tudor reign was very, very new. It was far from established. Henry didn't have an heir, and that continued to be a problem, as you know. And that Tudor rose you will find in the Mary Rose Museum is stamped on everything. It's really quite interesting. So this is Mary Rose under sail. This is a picture that was by Jeff Hunt, which was commissioned for the new Mary Rose Museum. It was the time when the shipbuild had switched over from the previous clinker design, where the planks overlapped each other, to the carvel design, where they were fitted on frames very close to each other. And although she was absolutely loaded with guns, and even more after Henry got his hands on her in the 1530s, it wasn't the period where the navies were trying to blast each other out of the water. The preferred method of battle was to get alongside your enemy's ships, try and board them, and take them into your own navy, because these were incredibly expensive pieces of kit, as were the guns which they were loaded with. So the key weapons for the hand-to-hand combat that was favoured were things such as pikes and bills and the ever-present English longbow, which had excelled so strongly at Agincourt and continued to even to this point in time. Because of this preferred method of battle, all of the ships therefore had installed anti-boarding netting on their upper decks, with the intent of being it was all impregnated with tar, the intent being if the enemy got on board, they couldn't easily hack their way below decks and take the ship over. And that proved to be fatal for the majority of the crew of Mary Rose, who were trapped underneath that boarding netting. Mary Rose sailed for 34 years. She saw Henry through 5.5 wives, and she fought in wars against the French in 1512 and 1522, and was quite probably one of the ships which helped carry Henry over to the famous Field of the Cloth of Gold meeting with the French Emperor Francis in 1520. She didn't see much action in between 1522 and the 1530s, and she was refitted in the 1530s with very close involvement from Henry VIII, who insisted on adding more and more and more guns. And that's why she ended up really quite top-heavy, and we think that probably contributed to her instability and her eventual sinking. So what happened with Mary Rose? Well, the most accurate picture that we have comes from this picture called the Cowdray engraving. You clearly can't see this very well, so I'm going to give you some close-ups in a minute. But if you come to the museum, it's on the wall, probably the similar size to the back of this theatre, so you can really see it in some depth. This is the only contemporary depiction of what happened that day. So the situation with France, while it was rarely straightforward, had become even more difficult after Henry's break with Rome in 1533 over his divorce. And his spies had informed him that a huge French invasion fleet was coming to invade at Portsmouth. It was 200 ships and over 30,000 men, and that makes it bigger than the Spanish Armada. But this is the battle that nobody's ever heard of. Henry and the court mobilised his army by sea and hurried over to Portsmouth to watch. And when you see the detail of this painting, if you come to the museum, you will see the whole of the court is there in front of Southsea Castle. So looking at a close-up, this is the top left of the picture, and you can probably see the French fleet massing up there. They're up near the Isle of Wight, and you can probably just see some smoke clouds, which is where they've sacked Bembridge on the Isle of Wight and set it on fire. Meanwhile, the plucky, much smaller English fleet is at anchor in Portsmouth Harbour and is just sitting there saying, come on then, and just waiting for the French to go for it. In the foreground, you can see a structure that's called Southsea Castle. That's still there today, actually, and you can see the view that Henry had during the Battle of the Solent. And if you look just below Southsea Castle, you can probably just see Henry VIII mounted on his horse, watching everything going on. In the foreground at the top, the French galleys were causing trouble. So our ships were all wind powered, but they had some galleys, so they were rowing over and coming to the English and starting a fight. And you can see the English ships starting to fire on them. And you can just about see, beyond this Southsea Castle picture, just above the top, can you see the masts of a ship? That's the moment when Mary Rose went down. That's a close-up there of some of the poor souls standing on her masts trying to save themselves. And Mary Rose went down in a matter of minutes, right in front of the king's horrified eyes. And apparently he said, they drowneth like rattan. So why did she sink? We don't know exactly, but there are several theories. The French, perhaps understandably, claim that they sunk her. Now, we only have half a ship, so we don't have archaeological evidence to show that that is the case. It's a possibility. The English talked of the crew being completely out of control, and the Admiral couldn't do anything. Now, clearly that plays to the reputation of the Admiral, so it doesn't look like he went down with his ship and looked incompetent. The most likely explanation is that Mary Rose was totally top-heavy with guns. She went to engage, fired from one side, went to turn. There was a very strong wind at that point. She probably tipped, the gun ports were open, water flooded in, and she literally went down in minutes. And as I've said, sadly, the majority of the crew got trapped underneath the anti-boarding netting and went down with the ship. Well, why was the loss of life so high? Well, mainly because sailors in those days couldn't swim. We just assume everyone can swim, but it was considered bad luck as a sailor to know how to swim. Go figure. So Mary Rose hit the bottom of the Solent on her starboard side and lay there. Henry sent Venetian salvage teams after her a couple of weeks after her sinking, and also the year after. But all they managed to do was to pull off the masts. So she was left and forgotten about. So anybody who knows the Solent, and some of you here may know this, it's a very silty environment. And over time, the waves took away the port side of the ship and slowly started building up sediment over the wreck of the ship. Until eventually the wreck and all of the artefacts and the human remains of the crew, of course, became sealed under a really hard layer of silt, which meant that no oxygen could get in. And that meant that the naval shipworm, which usually destroys wooden wrecks, just couldn't operate, meaning that the wreck and the artefacts were kept in a perfect state of suspended animation for centuries. So the next piece of Mary Rose's history. In the 1800s, there were a pair of brothers called the Dean brothers who were inventors, and they invented a helmet a smoke helmet for use in fires, which they then adapted into being the first diving helmet. And they were asked by local fishermen to investigate what their nets were snagging on. So they went down and they found some timbers, some guns and some bows from Mary Rose. They tried to make money out of them, didn't get very far, dropped a bomb on the site to try and blow some more contents out. Didn't get very far with that, but we now have the bomb as part of our archaeology, reassembled in the museum. But finally gave up because they couldn't make any money. But importantly, what they did is they marked the location of the wreck on a nautical map. And there she lay, undisturbed, for another 130 years. In 1965, there was a local amateur historian and diver called Alexander McKee, who was determined to find a number of ships that were sunk in the Solent, but particularly Mary Rose. He and his fellow members of the South Sea Sub-Aqua Club used what was the latest technology at that time, sonar scanning of the seabed, to try and find Mary Rose. Eventually, they found an odd W-shaped indentation. Between 1968 and 71, a group of divers investigated using water jets and makeshift airlifts, which were basically glorified vacuum cleaners, just sucking the silt out and throwing it a bit further away, and thereby excavating things. Finally, in 1971, strong storms uncovered the first of a deck timber, and they knew that they'd probably found Mary Rose. Over the next 7 years, frames, planking and deck beams were seen by divers at the wreck, and a series of limited excavations were carried out with the support of land archaeologist Margaret Rule. Everything was incredibly hand-to-mouth. The divers were all volunteering, and the minute they came off the boat at the end of the day, they were out raising money to raise the money for the fuel for the boat for the next day. It was literally that hand-to-mouth for a very long time. A lease was taken on the wreck site in 1971, and the next 7 years were spent carrying out excavations using volunteer divers. Thinking about Margaret Rule and Alexander McKee, we can't underestimate the impact these two people had on the recovery of Mary Rose. They were dogged. They were not giving up. There was no money. There was no time. It was too complicated. Nobody had ever done it. Certainly nobody had ever done an excavation of this scale. And their dream of getting Mary Rose into a museum of their own in Portsmouth just seemed like an unrealisable dream. Well, last year we realised it, and it would not have happened without their determination. In 1978, a trench across the wreck at the bow proved that 2 decks survived in situ, and the team decided to excavate the ship. And they formed the Mary Rose Trust in 1979 with His Royal Highness Prince Charles as the president. Full-time staff were appointed to carry out the work of excavating the ship and recording and conserving her contents. And that's kind of how it looked underwater. This is a drawing done by one of our divers, John Adams, who's now a professor of maritime archaeology at leads that function at Southampton University. So there's quite a complex grid system laid over the wreck. And even now, my curators will say, well, of course, that was discovered in M1. Like anybody else knows what that means. But they mean main deck 1 in terms of the cabins and everything. So everything was minutely recorded and excavated. And that's why we can tell the amazing stories that we can these days. Each section had to be carefully excavated, raised and recorded. And it took over 28,000 dives from 500 divers to do this. And it quickly became clear that we not only had a wreck here, but we had a complete treasure trove of Tudor artefacts that, due to the tragedy, could be dated to one specific day in 1545, which is unprecedented. Nowhere in the world is there a Tudor collection that covers every level of society, from officer in the upper deck to common sailor in the lower deck. Once the ship was emptied of its 19,000 artefacts, work began on raising the hull of Mary Rose. Just before we go to that, though, here are a couple of pictures of some of the excavations. So on the right-hand side, this was a series of immaculately preserved longbows that we found in a chest, and that's the picture of them underwater, completely covered in various bits of silt and so on. And the picture on the left is one of our divers, Adrian Barak, who had brought the first longbow up, and we couldn't believe what amazing condition they were in. And to give you an idea, this is a picture of one of the guns still poking down through the gun port of the ship. So she's on her starboard side and the guns are still in position poking through the gun ports. So they all had to be individually excavated, lifted, and these guns are 3 tons each. They're serious. Oh, sugar. Ooh. Slight flood. Sorry about that. I think we got away with it. So turning to how we excavated and raised the ship. There was a major engineering planning job underway to decide how to raise a waterlogged Tudor ship from the depths of the Solent. It's fair to say nobody had tried to do this before. So we got great support from a number of industrial partners, particularly Babcock, who designed that custom-made lifting cradle, the yellow cradle that if you've seen the ship being raised, you will recognise straight away. And Mary Rose still sits on that cradle today. We had 3 major challenges. The first one was to tunnel under the wreck to create the space so that we could drill into the wreck, attach some plates and attach lifting wires. So clearly you're tunnelling under a 400 to 500 ton wreck. It's not the safest thing to do. We had to transfer the wreck underwater into the lifting cable that she would actually be brought to the surface in. We couldn't attach the wires and then haul her up because she was so fragile. So we had to attach her and then move her into the lifting cradle. And most importantly, we had to raise her to the surface safely without breaking her. Nothing minor. In this illustration, you can see the start of this process with a diver using a water spray to tunnel under the wreck ahead of the drilling. This is an illustration of the lifting cradle that we actually used to raise Mary Rose. So there were adjustable legs. As you can imagine, the levels on the seabed were different. And you can see here that the cables are attached to the hull of Mary Rose ahead of her being transferred. Here's an illustration of one of the divers now attaching the cables to the fixings. And here's an illustration of the transfer. So she was picked up and moved over into the lifting cradle on these airbags to protect her before the hull was then raised to the surface. And many of you will remember that very iconic moment where Mary Rose was emerged from the sea after 437 years underwater. A really iconic moment, and it was watched by a TV audience of over 60 million worldwide. which sounds small these days, but actually at the time was enormous. And so many people say to me, oh yeah, we had to watch it at school, or I remember where I was at that moment. It's a really iconic moment, I think, in the nation's history. She was then floated on a barge into dry dock number 3 at Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, where she's rested ever since on her cradle. People tend to think she's been moved, but actually she stayed where she is, and we've just built round her. And she was only a couple of hundred yards from the dry dock where she was first built in 1509. A temporary cover building was put up. Temporary, actually lasted 31 years, as these things tend to. And Mary Rose opened to the public less than 12 months after being raised, not least because actually we needed to raise income. It costs an absolute fortune to look after a Tudor collection. Now, clearly with any archaeology, the minute you uncover it, either from the land or from the sea, it starts deteriorating. And there weren't that many other major wrecks that you could learn from. And we couldn't let Mary Rose dry out because her timber cells would literally have collapsed to dust. So for the first 12 years, while we were literally trying to figure out how to conserve her, she was sprayed with chilled water, partly to get some of the saline out, but mainly so that she couldn't dry out and get damaged. Some of you may know of Vasa. It's a fantastically preserved wreck that's in Stockholm. It's the #1 visitor attraction in Stockholm. They have a whole ship, but we've got a better collection. They were excavated in 1962. It so happened that the environment Vasa sank in doesn't allow the shipworm to live, so that's why they've actually got the whole of the ship. But they treated their ship with something called polyethylene glycol, which is a chemical wax. The idea being that the degraded timber cells within the ancient wreck have to be replaced with something before you dry it. So this chemical wax, if you spray it in there, can actually replace those cells, and you can then dry the ship safely. So that's what we did. So this is a picture of one of my team working in the ship hall, which was pretty much described as hell on wheels. Because this wax, if you want to spray it, you have to clearly render it into a liquid. And to be a liquid, it has to be at a very high temperature and an exceptionally high humidity. So my team were working in these full bodysuits and masks in 98% humidity and 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So any of you who've been to a humid place will know that that's pretty hot. So for 19 years, the ship was completely sealed within an insulated hotbox while this spraying was ongoing. So we had to make sure that we got complete coverage of all the timbers, and it actually got inside all of the timbers as well. And during that time, we carried out PhD research to establish the best way of drying the ship safely. So in 2013, when the new museum opened, the sprays were all switched off, and we entered a drying regime where the ship was still sealed in her insulated hotbox, but fabric drying pipes were hung over the decks to ensure that an even drying rate was achieved. Finally, in 2016, the drying was completed, and Mary Rose was unveiled to the public in her dry state for the first time since 1545. But we're getting slightly ahead of ourselves, and I'd like to go back to those artefacts and what we did to conserve them before we go back to the museum. The other thing I should note is that in terms of science behind Mary Rose, there were very complex computational fluid dynamics behind the drying regime that we used. We needed to make sure that all elements of the ship got the same temperature, relative humidity and velocity to make sure that one part of the hull didn't dry faster than another, so that we could avoid warping, shrinkage and cracking. And the way we monitored that was by taking tiny core samples regularly, and we weighed them on taking them out, dried them out and weighed them again to calculate how dry those timbers were. Over 3 years, we took out 100 tons of water from the ship, which is phenomenal, quite frankly. Some of you may have seen an article recently in the Telegraph, which suggested Mary Rose was collapsing. Have you seen it? Good, not many, I like that. So we did a presentation at New Scientist recently, just explaining the work that we've been doing with the hull. And the Telegraph ran a fantastic article that was entirely accurate, then ran a headline saying, Mary Rose is collapsing, which is a little bit misleading, I think is how I would put it politely. So what's actually happening? What happens to timber when it dries? It shrinks. We know this. It cracks a bit. We know this. It's 500 years old. So we've been monitoring the condition of the ship throughout using laser scans. And the pictures here show some of the laser scans that we've done over the years. And the one on the right-hand side in particular is our 2009 scan overlaid with our 2016 scan. And it shows that there has been some movement. And frankly, we'd have expected that. We've been putting additional support in place to deal with this already. But what we do need to do is devise a revised support system for the decks, because if you think about it, you haven't got a full ship here. You've got half a ship, so those beams are not actually attached to anything. They're in fresh air. So as the ship has now dried, we're working on that revised support system, and we'll put that in. So while the ship was being conserved, what was happening with all those artefacts? We raised over 19,000 artefacts, which is phenomenal. And it was unprecedented. As I said, the Tudor collections in existence are typically those of royal people or upper class people. Everyday objects were typically used until they collapsed, so nobody ever kept them. So we have the only collection of everyday items that people like you and I would have used. The collection ranges from the professional, things like guns and longbows and carpentry tools, navigational equipment and medical equipment, to the deeply personal, leather shoes, rosaries, knit combs, and we have Tudor knits. How many museums can say they have Tudor knits in their collection? This makes me happy. Tiny, tiny dice. We have dice that big that were excavated from the floor of the seabed of the Solent. It's just phenomenal. And even the skeleton of the ship's dog, Hatch, of which I shall tell you more in a moment. So in conservation terms, there's a huge range of size. You've got everything from tiny gold coins and dice up to giant guns and wooden carriages, and a huge variety of materials: wood, leather, iron, bone, pewter, all of which has been lying beneath the sea for 440 years. It's a pretty unprecedented conservation challenge. Initially, when we brought things up, it's fair to say that Wall's ice cream was incredibly helpful. Everything was being conserved in ice cream tubs. And we still have a lot of them. A lot of the samples from the Solent are still in these 40-year-old ice cream tubs. But this was Mary Rose all the way. It was being run on a shoestring, going out and raising money all the time just to keep things going. As we move towards creating the museum, we now have a conservation centre on Portsmouth Naval Base. And within it, we have giant tanks and giant vacuum dryers, because that's what we need to actually process vast numbers of artefacts. So thinking a moment about the conservation challenges, the picture on the left shows a wooden bowl at the point that it came out when it had been excavated. So you can see its condition was not great. And the one on the right shows it when it's been conserved. And you can see the rather wonderful individual symbols that the guy who owned it has scratched on there, because he's not literate and they need to know whose bowl is who. Clearly the conserved object looks better, but there's also another story of what's happening to the material below the surface. So if you look at a piece of Mary Rose oak and you look beyond what the naked eye can see, using a light microscope and an electron microscope, you can start to see the sort of deterioration that's not visible to the naked eye. So in the interior, the cells are pretty well preserved actually, but on the surface, some of the wood structure has gone, so that that's in the degraded exterior picture. And the compound that occupies this area is cellulose, which is essentially glucose, and therefore exactly what bacteria like snacking on. And the damage isn't that apparent when the object is wet, because the water occupying this space is bulking it out and disguising the problem. But if you just let this sort of wood object dry, all of the cells would collapse and you'd see huge damage. So what do? Instead of spraying everything, if they're a lot smaller, you can treat them in tanks. So we have these giant swimming pools that we put timbers and artefacts in, and we treat them in a tank, initially filled with water, and we keep adding more and more of this chemical wax. And it typically takes about 2 years to impregnate fully, and you can get a lot of stuff in tanks, so you can probably see from the picture on the left, that's a sort of an idea of the sort of bulk conservation we were doing. And following this, we have giant freeze dryers. So these things are around 6 meters long. They're absolutely colossal. And what we do is after these things have been treated, the artifacts are frozen and any remaining water in the wood turns into ice. and a pressure is applied, which then turns the ice directly from a solid into a gas, bypassing the liquid stage, and that reduces the time for drying, and it reduces the damage that you're going to get from things like cracking. And then you end up with something which looks like the things on the left, which don't look very pretty. So there's time then needed by conservators to do surface treatments to clean off the residual chemical wax and any other contaminants before the artefact's reassembled and put on display. And I have a conservator who thinks she has the best job in the world. She spends her life reassembling shields, barrels. Honestly, she's like the ultimate jigsaw puzzle person. She puts bark back on logs that have come from the Mary Rose galley. It's such a great job. And clearly not all is plain sailing in this particular job. So these artefacts have been below the surface for a long time. Particularly with wood, we have problems with acids. So wood that's been down in sediments can get sulfur incorporated into it through bacterial reactions. And when it's exposed to oxygen, when it comes to the surface, it can oxidize, and then you get acids appearing. And this is a picture of a Mary Rose chest where oxidization and acids have appeared. So one of the things that we do is a huge amount of conservation research to understand how we can treat these things. And these need to be treatments that are topical. So what we create is a sort of paste which we put on there to start drawing iron out of those, and it's something that we hope we will be able to use on the ship if the problem develops there as well, because we clearly can't move the ship anywhere, so we need to have topical treatments. Many of you will know the actor Robert Hardy, who died in August, sadly. He was one of our strongest supporters. Not everybody knows he was the preeminent longbow specialist, pretty much in the world actually, and wrote two very scholarly works on it. So he was called within 2 days of the first bow coming up from Mary Rose, and he came straight down, realising this was going to be the project of his life. And this is a picture of Robert actually in the cellar of his own house, where he created a conservation area to actually dry out the Mary Rose bows and then eventually oil them and get them into top condition for display. But because one of the things that's quite unique about Mary Rose is the fact that we don't have one of things. We typically have lots of things. So most places, if you excavated, you'd find one bow. There were 2 bows of this era before Mary Rose came up in the entire world. We've now got 140, and 138 of them live with us. So that's allowed us to do what we call experimental archaeology. So Robert actually strung and fired a number of the bows, because he needed to calculate what loads these archers were actually using, how fast they were, what distances they were firing from. And it's things like this that enable you to discover the stories and really tell those really compelling stories in the museum. More experimental archaeology. We like experimental archaeology. So again, we have lots of guns. They wouldn't stand up to being fired, sadly. So what we've actually done is to create replicas. And we did these with Fort Nelson down near us, created replicas, and we've actually loaded and fired them because nobody really knew how Tudor guns had actually been used before. So that helped us work out how many men were needed to load and fire a gun, which was 5, and how loud it was, what the report was, what the impact it had on the body. All of these things help us tell better stories. And at the time, we didn't know a great deal about Tudor cooking. And we found 2 galleys on the Mary Rose, brick galleys with beautiful lead-lined cauldrons. You can understand why people didn't live that long, can't you? But we didn't know how would they have fed 500 men on board ship with these galleys. The only way we could figure they'd done it was to actually get bags of meat and actually suspend them in the 500 litres of broth that they were actually cooking at any one time. We worked out how they'd been cooking bread on the galley, all sorts of things. And when you go to somewhere like Hampton Court and look at something like their kitchens, they came to us to find out how the Tudors cook. They'll tell you otherwise, but... And the bottom right is some shipwriting activity that we do annually. So here we have a couple of our volunteers crafting a ship's knee. These are the bits that are on the inside of the ship that support the decks. And they are things of beauty. They're carved out of one piece of wood. And this was our team in August carving this beautiful knee, which is now resting in front of the museum. So returning to the museum, so Mary Rose was encased within this tent-like structure, and you can see HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship, to the left there. And as you can see, it wasn't really a planned solution because there was a whole office block in front of us. This was not really a visitor attraction in the making. So we struggled through with this for quite a long time. It was an enormously long road to building a purpose-built museum. There were many discussions over the years about whether Mary Rose should be moved somewhere else in Portsmouth, or even whether she should go to London. Quite honestly, if we were in London, I suspect we'd see 1.5 million visitors a year, undoubtedly. But she is of Portsmouth. She was built in Portsmouth. She fought in Portsmouth. She sunk in Portsmouth. She was raised in Portsmouth. So it is the right place for her. Several designs were developed and rejected, and it soon became clear that an absolutely Herculean fundraising effort was going to be needed. And over the years, £38 million was raised from the Heritage Lottery Fund, but also from private donations, charitable trusts. This is a phenomenal amount of money. I've been fundraising for 15 years. I've never heard of this much money being raised. The team did a phenomenal job. And that was to build the museum, but also all of the environmental systems that were needed. So when you go around the museum, what you don't see is the 3 plant rooms supporting everything. The fact that everything has to be kept at a different relative humidity and temperature. It really is quite an operation. We had 2 particular problems when we were trying to design a museum. One was that we only had half a ship. So we had to incorporate that into the design. The other one was that we got the go-ahead in terms of our funding to build the museum, but we weren't ready to finish the spraying. So we had to actually create the museum in 2 phases. So this is the architect's concept for the Mary Rose. So the fact that we only had half a ship was turned into a benefit. So the whole of the museum is designed around the ship. So the ship is the pearl at the centre of the oyster. And the ship is displayed on the right-hand side. And what we've actually done is create a mirror image of the ship on the other side of the museum. And within there, all of the artefacts that were discovered are displayed exactly opposite where they were excavated. We have exactly that pinpoint detail on it. And if you go to the museum, you will see that even the decks bow in line with the bowing of the Mary Rose decks. It really is that detailed. My notes are getting wetter as we go through, so you have to bear with me. So problem 2, we needed to carry on spraying before the museum was finished. So this insulated hot box couldn't be moved. So we had to build the museum over the top of it. So we built the new museum over the top of the old museum. Problem being, at some point, the old museum had to be ripped out of the new museum, which is what we did last year, of which more in a moment. The other issue was that we were building over a listed dry dock. Now, typically with buildings, as you know, you will pile foundations. Can't do that in a listed dry dock. So the whole museum is braced over the dry dock without piling into it. So it's fair to say this is probably the biggest engineering nightmare you're ever going to come across. It was a very, very complex project. So the museum that opened in 2013 was phase 1 of the design. So the artefacts are presented in the long galleries facing the ship. And you can see here on the right, the reconstructed galley. And the ship was on the other side. But because she was still sealed in this insulated hot box covered with drying tubes, all you could see was little bits through windows, and you couldn't really see the ship because of the drying tubes. So that was only ever phase 1 of our presentation. This is what the museum looks like. So this is the oyster design, the Mary Rose being the jewel in the jewel box, the pearl at the centre of the oyster. And this has won phenomenal amounts of awards, actually, in terms of architecture. It's a beautiful design. So what of the actual experience? So I've already outlined that Mary Rose is the key ship of a key king, Henry VIII. Through her extensive collection, she illuminates life from every level of society and gives an unparalleled view into life in the 16th century. Dr. David Starkey, who's one of our trustees, describes Mary Rose as England's Pompeii. All of Tudor life is there. And it was created by a single dramatic moment in time. So the story that we tell is intensely personal. It's the story of the crew who lived, worked, slept, ate and relaxed on board. Through the enormous personal collection, we can tell unparalleled stories of Tudor life. It's a time capsule. The collection ranges from all the professional items we've discussed previously to the deeply personal, the nip combs, the musical instruments, the backgammon board, the shoes, the medicines that the crew were treated with, tiny dice and the skeleton of the ship's dog, and of course the human remains of all the men who perished within the ship. They've enabled us to find out so much about life in Tudor times and to tell fantastic stories, and that's what the museum's all about. It's dedicated to the crew and it tells their stories in some depth. Visitors tell us that they connect across the centuries. They look at a knit comb and think, do you know what? I've got one of those in my cupboard. It might be metal, but it's the same thing. Or they look at the boot, this beautiful knee boot, brown leather knee boot, that frankly, if I had, I'd be wearing tomorrow. You can recognise stuff that is from your own everyday life, and I think that's what makes it so powerful. So in each of the end galleries, we go into the stories of those individual crew members, and we know exactly what their jobs were because all of their possessions are in that particular cabin. So this is the cook's case, and interestingly, you would have thought a ship in the 16th century would have all English sailors, right? So we had quite a few Spaniards on board. We think our cook was Dutch because he was one of the few literate guys and he'd scrawled his name on his bowl, Nykoop. So we have his knit comb, his most beautiful little turned wooden spoon, his knives, his cooking equipment, his shoes. It really is very, very special. And the idea is that the museum is completely immersive. I actually struggle sometimes to say the word museum because for me, museum conjures up a not particularly interactive experience. With Mary Rose, when you go in the museum, it's dark. And that's not necessarily because of conservation reasons. It's because we want you to know what the light levels were like on board for these guys. And they were dark. It was not a nice environment. We have lots of noises of the ship creaking and the dog barking and the watch bell going, all trying to make you feel like you're part of the experience. And you get an opportunity to try a longbow, to smell pieces of Mary Rose's original rope, to handle pieces of the ship. And amusingly, not so amusingly for the visitors in question, we quite often have to evacuate people from the museum because they're really suffering from seasickness. This is genuine and it's regular. And people say to us, how do you make the floors move? Well, we're not doing anything. It's the fact that it's dark, the floors are bowed, you can hear all the sounds around you. And it's a genuine issue for us that evacuating people for seasickness, which I think is fantastic. But not if you're that person, obviously. Moreover, this is the really poignant story of 465 men who lost their life in a maritime disaster. So within the collection, we have the human remains of 179 of the crew who died on that tragic day. There were no crew lists, so we don't know the names of anybody except for the Admiral. In 1983, one of the skeletons was buried with due ceremony at Portsmouth Cathedral to provide a grave of the unknown sailor, so that we have somewhere to commemorate each year, every year on the sinking. We thought it was really important to honour the crew by telling their stories as fully as we could in the museum. So there's a phenomenal amount of science goes into the telling of those stories. So we've conducted all sorts of DNA research so that we can actually find out where these guys came from, their eye colour, their hair colour. We've reconstructed their faces of a number of the crew through a very complex reconstruction technique because we all relate to individuals. If you talk about the Romans, it doesn't mean as much as knowing about a particular gladiator called Tiberius who had a wife called Livia or whatever it is. People relate to individuals, and that's what we've tried to do within the museum. Sucking in water fast here. We've also been able to look at what sort of illnesses and issues that these guys had. In fact, I should go back a minute because the skeleton of the archer that you've got in the middle there we've learnt a phenomenal amount about archery and its impact on the bone structure. So we work very closely with the sports science section at Swansea University about the impact on the body of pulling these loads from the bows. Because if you were living under the reign of Henry VIII, he constantly thought you needed to be ready for war, and every boy over the age of 7 had to practice archery every day. And what you see is the impact on the skeleton. So on this one, you can see that you can't see, but up close you can see his spine is completely twisted. One side of his body is grossly overdeveloped where he's been pulling these loads for years. And there are bones in your shoulder, don't ask me which ones, please, which fuse as you're a teenager. And with these archers, they haven't, because they've been pulling the loads all this time. And we have all sorts of things, like there's a terrible skull of a poor man whose entire jaw is eaten away, and he had a terrible tooth abscess that had eaten away his jaw. And can you imagine the agony he must have been in? How did he even eat? So it's given us tremendous information about diseases and things that these guys suffered from. And we can do things like look at the bones to actually look at the difference between Mary Rose tibia and modern healthy tibia to identify conditions like rickets. We've identified scurvy as well. And the Mary Rose dog, this is ever popular. I had a chat to somebody today who ventured the suggestion that actually people are more upset by the fate of the dog than of the 500 men, which is a terribly English thing to say, isn't it? And it does seem to be the case, I'm afraid. So Hatch was the ship's dog, and he was the ratter on board. So it was considered unlucky to have cats on board, so dogs were on board as ratters. Now, we only found one rat on board of Mary Rose. So there's two possible theories here. Either that Hatch was a very good ratter, or the rats were operating typical to form and leaving a sinking ship. So Hatch is one of the most memorable artefacts in the Mary Rose Museum. And again, science has really helped us to tell his story. To understand more about him, you can see top right, one of his teeth was removed, and we did DNA testing. Now, in Tudor times, there weren't breeds as such in the way that we would understand them, but the nearest sort of breed type that he matches is a Jack Russell with a bit of whippet. And we know that his coat colour was brown, and he carries a genetic disease that still turns up in Jack Russells today. And Hatch is a bit of a star. Hatch went to Crufts one year, and he won his category of archaeological dog. Perhaps unsurprisingly, he was the only entrant. And even cod. So we have all of the stocks from Mary Rose. So we have all the beef and pork bones, the cod and all sorts of things. And we did DNA analysis on the Mary Rose cod. And what it suggests is that local cod stocks couldn't keep up with demand because this cod came from Iceland. So were we trading with Iceland? Or did we have long-distance swimming cod? Who knows? But it tells stories again, doesn't it? We also use research around things like our gold coins. So we can actually analyse how much the content of gold is actually in these coins. And again, this helps us tell stories. So the coins that were minted in the reign of Henry VII, who was well known for being quite careful with his money, shall we say, are 100% gold. But then you find the ones that were minted in the reign of Henry VIII, and they are severely watered down with copper. No doubt spent on his wives, his clothes, his jousts and everything else that he likes. It tells you stories about different directions that different kings followed. And we also use science to help identify archaeological objects that won't always seem that obvious. So in the dives that we did in 2005, we came up with this long sort of lollipop-shaped structure. And for a while, we weren't quite sure what it was. We found it near the bow of the ship. But then we looked back at the Antony roll, which is this picture on the right, which is an inventory of Henry's ships and all of their contents. And on there, you can't see really, but on the very far side, there's a little lollipop, which has got the Tudor rose on it. So it was one of the earliest figureheads for a ship. And we actually got the University of Portsmouth to scan this and reconstruct it to show how it would have looked like with its Tudor rose branding on. And that suddenly makes something that can look a bit like what's that into something that people can understand. So science underpins so much of what we do. So going back to the museum, so we had this setup whereby you could only see the ship through the insulated hot box. And we moved to a position whereby we had to rip the old museum out of the centre of the new museum. I think you can probably imagine the level of my risk register at this point when we're ripping an entire museum from above a Tudor ship. It was a bit of a shaky moment, I have to say. Our contractors were brilliant. Nothing was dropped, nothing was broken, and we ripped it all out. And what we've actually done now is to display the ship in all of her glory. So on main and lower decks, we have full-length glazing around all of the galleries, so you can see Mary Rose all the way down there. And the big difference this has made is we finally reunited the collection with the ship. As you walk down the walkway, you can see the ship and you have the contents directly next to you. And it gives absolutely fabulous views. And on upper deck, visitors pass through airlocks and they go into the air-conditioned space of the ship hall. So when you go in there, you are breathing the same air as Henry VIII's warship, which is quite cool. It's literally quite cool, actually. And one of the things that people said about Mary Rose is they struggle to identify her as a ship, because when you see a ship, you typically see the outside of her, don't you? And what you're seeing here is the inside. So another thing we've introduced in the works we did last year is to bring the crew to life. So there are 66 different films. 33 relate to wartime and 33 relate to peacetime. And they're projected into the cabin of exactly, you know, we know it was the carpenter's cabin because he found his stuff. So the carpenter is projected in there. Hatch is barking around his feet all the time. We've got people rolling up rope, setting up guns, drinking ale, playing dice, playing musical instruments. So in peacetime, they're doing all of that. In wartime, they're firing guns, they're shooting arrows. The barber surgeon is amputating a leg. And these were all done using our own staff and volunteers who are very, very keen on dressing up, it has to be said. They do like a bit of dressing up. And we filmed them using students from the University of Portsmouth's creative and cultural industries with professional supervision. So there are some students out there who have had the best possible work experience you can imagine. And these have been transformational for our visitor experience. I remember I brought a school in the week before we opened to test the impact on them. It was a bunch of 13, 14-year-olds, you can imagine, roll through the door, oh, boring ship, why are we even here, can't make my phone work, all of that. And the films came on and they literally all turned and went like that on the glass. And after that, they really interacted with the whole museum. And their teacher couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. And it really has been that transformational. But it's the same with adults as well. It just brings the story to life. So that pretty much concludes my sodden presentation. So a final note from me. From the start, we've been a charity that have been fundraising to support our work, and it's a constant struggle, if I'm honest with you. We're entirely dependent on visitor income. We see, this year we'll see about 360,000 visitors, but that doesn't cover the costs of looking after a Tudor collection. So we're entirely dependent on generosity of supporters to help us care for these Tudor collections for the future. To give you an idea, just conserving the collection, and this means the environmental systems, the staff that look after it, the energy, that costs over £1 million a year. So we are very, very keen, if anybody is able to support us with however big or however small a donation, we would receive incredibly gratefully. And if anybody is able to come down and see us in Portsmouth, only 90 minutes from Waterloo, we would love to see you. And I hope you found that interesting, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helen. That's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, so has anybody got any questions? Yes, at the back there. Helen.
Were the crew all male on board?
They were. They were, and they ranged from 10 years old up to about 43. But yes, this is a matter of some upset to me, I have to tell you. Because when it came to filming the little films, I desperately wanted to be in it. Everybody else was in it. And what they said to me, I was quite new at the time, and they didn't know me very well, and they very delicately had to say, "You're not really androgynous enough," which is a fair comment. So I'm not in the films. I'm quite upset about it.
43 was a good age, wasn't it?
I think it was.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the skulls of these guys, every single one, they've got 2 or 3 teeth. They've got abscesses eating it away. I mean, frankly, getting to 43 must have been quite a result, considered. Yes.
Do you know what happened to it?
No.
And,
I don't.
and who won the Battle of the Somme?
We did.
Oh,
Eventually, the French turned tail and ran away. So, but yeah, it's one of those battles. It's amazing that nobody's ever heard of it, isn't it? When it was bigger than the Spanish Armada. But I guess it was a pretty embarrassing result, wasn't it? In many ways. And Peter Pomegranate, if you're wondering, was named after, again, St. Peter, and pomegranate was Catherine of Aragon's symbol. Yeah.
There's a gentleman at the back there and then another gentleman in the middle here.
You mentioned earlier that material was found in the surrounding silt away from the hull.
Mm-hmm.
And you also said earlier on that one of the previous expeditions had used a vacuum system to blow silt all over the place. Did you know the location of that, and were there deposits actually found away from the hull completely?
Absolutely. So I probably should have been a bit clearer about that. So all the way through the excavation, the guys were basically using paintbrushes to gently sweep away silt, and using these big airlifts that are about that big, and basically sucked up the silt and threw it over onto spoil heaps away, which meant you ended up with these gigantic mountains of spoil all around the ship. And I mean, the ship hit the seabed with such an impact that contents went everywhere. And we very much don't have everything. So, for example, the bow castle of the ship, like there's several layers of the bow, is still down there, and we do have ambitions to go after it at some point. But as I've outlined already, the minute you raise these things, you have to be ready to conserve them, and there's a phenomenal cost associated with that. But for the future, we would like to do that.
Yes, gentleman in the middle.
Yes, you mentioned rosaries. So, I mean, was Roman Catholicism accepted on the ship? I mean, is there any thoughts as to you know, obviously Henry VIII was the person who fought against Catholicism.
He was.
So, was it accepted? And is there any sort of implications of it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question, isn't it? Because Henry had broken with the church in around 1533, and this was 1545. So you would have thought there wouldn't be any rosaries on board. We found about 19 of them. So I think I suppose for me, there's probably two possible explanations for this. One was that this was Henry's decision. And if anybody who's tried to manage change in an organisation, anybody tried to do that? Try managing an entire nation. So, you know, there's a strong chance, I think, that hadn't filtered down and people were still doing what they were very committed to. But the other possible description is that Henry's version of Protestantism is not our version of Protestantism. Henry's version of Protestantism is basically Catholicism without the Pope. We tend to think in quite binary fashion, don't we? Catholics, Protestants, but remember it was very close. But there were a lot of them. And they're beautiful, lots of bone ones.
It must have been very disappointing for all the people who originally looked at Mary Rose, all those people with the chaps with the helmet and so on, the early archaeologists. But presumably the success of the project has actually rested on the fact that the early people did not succeed in raising it from the seabed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I'd say is there's a wonderful diaspora of Mary Rose people. So we recently had the 35th anniversary of the raising, and we invited back all of the divers who could come, and we had over 120 came back. Everything from the Royal Engineers who came in for a month. Gosh, they were rowdy at dinner, I have to tell you. They know how to party. So these guys, it's really interesting actually. For these guys, it was such a bonding experience. It's actually very difficult for anybody else to understand. And to an extent, their experience was then, and they like to see the museum, but that's not their experience in some ways. So we try and involve everybody who's been involved over the years, because it's one of those things that once the Mary Rose bug gets you, it stays with you for life. I mean, why am I in this job? I'm in this job because my mum took me down to see Mary Rose when I was 13, the year after the ship came up. And I still remember the goosebumps I was in for weeks. It's given me goosebumps now talking about it. And it's only Mary Rose and the Egyptian Museum that have ever had that effect on me. So once you get that Mary Rose bug, come down and get the Mary Rose bug. We'd love to see you. But I mean, there's so many people. We had all the team from Babcock up the other week. So the MD, who's now retired, two guys who were apprentices at the time who worked on assembling the cradle. we took them round and they literally couldn't speak. I mean, people either come out raving or they literally come out choked and they can't communicate. It's really that powerful. So it's the most wonderful cause to be associated with.
Can I just ask you, as a matter of interest, what was the depth of water that it was actually sunk in?
Sure. So it was about 12 metres.
12 meters.
And then the ship was actually buried about 7 metres below that. So they had to burrow through 7 metres worth of silt to get her out. So it was relatively shallow.
Yes.
Yeah, it was very lucky.
Hi, you mentioned the DNA testing on the dog, and
Yeah.
I think you said you'd done some on the skeletons, and you know, how much do you intend to do, and how much have you found out, and anything surprising in that?
Yeah, you know, I pretty much failed O-level biology, so my understanding of this is really rubbish. So it's been explained to me in words of one syllable, which is the way CEOs tend to understand things, I find. But it's astonishing what you can find out from the DNA. So we know, I mentioned that we have some Spanish people. So that's from the DNA testing. We have the eye colours, we have the hair colours, which I just find astonishing from 500-year-old remains. We know the diseases that they suffered from. We're about to start doing another piece of DNA testing because at the moment we've actually DNA tested on the particular individuals that we talk about in the museum. We have nearly 180 sets of remains. We're not sure which bones belong to which skeleton in some instances. So one of the things we'd really like to do is to be able to identify what bones belong to which skeleton so that we can reunite them. But you can also, I was sat with the guy who does the DNA testing for us from Portsmouth University, and he was saying, it's amazing, you can literally isolate things that tell you about things like whether they're like cucumber. I was like, what? I was going, yes, I mean, I don't understand how you can do that, but there are so many more stories we could be telling. And the Admiral, his descendants, the Crew family, are very keen to understand whether we have his skeleton, and they're prepared to give DNA samples to enable us to do that. But we'd have to sample 180 skeletons to see if we've got him. And he was probably on the upper deck, so he may have been washed off. So, you know, it's incredibly expensive. So we're constantly seeking sort of research funding through the universities to do it. But I mean, it's endlessly fascinating, I have to say.
Yes.
Sorry.
So we've got at least 3 coming up. So I've got you 2 over there. Yes, well. Yeah.
I have a question from our audience in Aberdeen. They ask, are there any other ships to be found near the wreck of the Mary Rose?
Ah, good question. I mean, there were quite a few sunk in the Solent. There's a particular one which was Henry V's Great Harry, which has been, they think they may have discovered in the Hamble River near Southampton, but it's very much not sure that is the right ship. You're more likely to find wrecks on the Goodwin Sands over near Kent. So one of my curators does a lot of contract work, and she's been excavating a couple of wrecks out there at the moment. So there are others, but I think Mary Rose was the most famous one, and I think that Great Harry would be another one. Yes, Southampton.
Yes.
Lady over here.
I was just going to ask you if you found something else today. What will modern technology and science do differently if you found something as precious as this?
Oh, that's a good question, isn't it? I suspect my conservators would tell you that the technology hasn't really moved on. So to say that the best you can do is to soak things in chemical wax, there really hasn't been a better solution found so far. So I'm not sure that they'd do anything that differently. What they might do, if we got the bow castle up, which would be a significant back portion of the ship, how would we conserve that? I think that's a really interesting question, because we have space for it in the ship hull, but we obviously can't spray it because the rest of the ship's dry. So do we put it in a tank? I suppose some of it depends on what sort of shape it's in. Is it in one piece or is it in smaller pieces? Do you have to reassemble it? It's all of those unknowns, really. But no, techniques I don't think have changed enormously. I mean, one technique that's quite interesting is our iron shot we have quite a lot of problems with. So we've tried to conserve it, and some of it is now exploding from the inside, so it's corroding. And in the 1980s, it was considered acceptable. Just going back, the process of conservation is basically based on can it be reversible? It has to be. In the 1980s, with this iron shot, some of them were actually put through a hydrogen reduction furnace, and that changed their chemical structure completely, which is a real no-no in conservation terms. but they're the ones that aren't falling apart. So in conservation terms, is it better to change their chemical structure and have something for the future? Or is it better to do it the way you should and have it collapse? I'm probably in the, you've got so many of them that you can afford to do a bit of both, as you rightly say. But I'm probably in the camp of, really? Are we going to let it fall apart, so future generations can't see it? Always very topical, that one.
So was there just a question? Yes, yes.
Are there any big puzzles or unanswered questions that are really exercising the minds of researchers?
Oh, gosh. Always. So our latest one, which my curator told me on the tube, I was like, where did that come from? She's got a piece of rope. She's got several pieces of rope, actually, in fact, acres of the stuff, let's be honest. But this particular piece of rope is about that thick. And she's got some separate smaller bits coming off it. And she was going, is this a cat and nine tails? But they didn't exist until 200 years after that. So she's taking it off to be DNA tested to see if there's blood on it. And if there is, we may have the earliest cat and nine tails. Or we may not. It's a constant piece of detective work. So we found something, the barber surgeon's cabin. We found this really odd little chain. And we had no idea what it was. And people worried over it for about 20 years. What's this chain? What does it do? What does it signify? And then somebody went to look at the Holbein picture of Henry and the barber surgeons. And this picture has Henry's personal barber surgeon kneeling next to him, and he's the only one that has a little chain on his clothes. So did we have Henry's personal barber surgeon on the Mary Rose? Constant detective work, huge fun.
Okay, I think perhaps got time for just one last question before we go and have a drink. David.
I've got a trivial question, but it's bothering me. You showed a reconstructed sailor's face with hair and no beard. Does that mean that the barber was shaving them for the purpose of no nits or whatever? Or because every picture I've seen of sailors in bars at that time, they were bearded.
It's a really good question. I don't think we have any way of knowing whether they were bearded at the time. It's probably highly likely, isn't it? But bear in mind, these guys probably hadn't been on the ship more than a couple of days. So the voyages they did were no more than 1 or 2 weeks at this time. So we have this vision of sailors going halfway across the world and beards down to their knees. And it probably would have been a bit different. So we don't know from that perspective. But yes, he did do shaving and haircuts and everything as well. And I'm judging by the number of knit combs and the knits that we have in our collection, it was quite a problem. We always get back to knits. I love knits.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Helen, for a really fascinating evening. I'm sure we've all got the Mary Rose bug. So thank you.
Thank you.